Everyone, my name is Daniel Hen, postdoc at the University of Galway in Ireland, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today, which is Ireland. Title of my presentation: Integrated FOLO Modeling at the National Scale for a Climate Neutral, Food Secure and Bio-Based Future. So I'm going to dive straight in, talk a little bit about Ireland's climate challenges that the country is facing at the moment. Many of you, when you hear Ireland, you probably think about very green landscapes, and that's exactly right. About 70% of the landscape of the land cover is grassland used for pastures, especially for cattle and sheep. And those vast areas come at a price in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So about 1/3 of all emissions of the whole country are from the agricultural sector, and within that sector, about 70% are methane, coming from enteric fermentation and manure management mostly, and almost all of the rest of emissions are from manure management and agricultural soils. So in particular, manure spreading as well as inorganic fertilizer application. And at the moment, there's a 2030 target to reduce emissions by 25% compared to a 2018 baseline. In addition to these emissions from the agricultural sector, we have further emissions from the LULUCF sector, which is quite rare in Europe, where usually there's a sink in place. In Ireland, unfortunately, it's not. So especially from wetlands and from grasslands, we have quite a lot of emissions that can't be balanced from the forest sector, which is only about 10% in Ireland in terms of the land cover. And across these sectors, we have a 2050 target to meet net zero. What exactly net zero means, I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. But this is the target in place. And how do we go about developing different scenarios of how we can meet these? So over the past 5 years, my colleagues have started to develop the Goblin model, which is a biophysical land balance model that starts basically with different livestock systems and looking at the properties of these animals and their feed and land area requirements, and from there developing a strong synthesis between the agriculture and the grassland sector. So looking how much grass is required, building different cohorts of animals that respond to certain grass areas, as well as feed that is coming externally. In addition, we're looking at, in terms of emissions, we're looking at the FOLO scale, similar to national inventory reporting. So apart from agriculture, we have grassland, croplands, forestry, organic soils present within forestry, as well as grasslands and harvested wood products. And as we're talking in particular today about the relationships between agriculture and forestry, one important thing that we're looking at presently is linking soil groups and how, for example, transitioning agricultural soils towards forestry soils, and how these are linked in terms of spatial soil groups, of which there are 3 in Ireland, which are based on agronomic performance and the overall quality of the soils in terms of how productive they are for crop production, grassland production, forestry production, and carbon sinks within them, as well as potential for rewetting. So, for example, if we're looking at higher quality soils that are used for agricultural production, how would that impact forestry production if we replace that and have a land cover transition there? Obviously, a lot more potential for higher carbon sinks from those more productive soils as well. In terms of the scenario rationale for the work that I've carried out throughout my PhD over the past few years, the first target was to maintain current levels of bovine protein production within the country. So there was 440 kilotons of pure protein. Pure protein in that case means milk having a 3.5% protein content, beef having about a 23% protein content, and we estimated and how much of that is possible within net zero constraints. In addition, we're looking at 7 greenhouse gas mitigation aspects that are proven to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector or create carbon sinks in the land use sector. And the third level of the scenario rationale is to look at different levels of ambition. So we range from the first ambition, that is basically the 2020 baseline of what is currently happening. And then we have one very ambitious level, looking at current literature, what is possible through different mitigation measures, and one that is sitting in between. And that means, to summarize, it is a very ambitious approach in one sense, is that in that we assume a very high adoption rate of these different measures, but at the same time it is conservative because we look at a time frame until 2050 and we don't assume any measures that are not currently available. So everything has been scientifically proven, and it's a kind of a matter of uptake of deploying these measures into practice. Two vocabularies that are going to be very important here that I'd like to define. First one being spared land, which is grassland that is currently used as pasture land under agricultural production, which would become available for diversification into other land uses, forestry as an example. And secondly, one very important caveat is that productivity increases of the agricultural production will result in spared land rather than further animal stocking. Because one obvious choice would be to, we're getting more productive with our systems. Let's just bring in a lot more livestock, and that's not going to work in terms of net zero scenarios. So, looking at the 7 different mitigation measures here, just very quickly going through them. So first of all, at the top there, livestock profile and productivity. So we're looking at the current livestock herd and assume certain increases in milk production, as well as reductions in, secondly, the average slaughter age, which means that we assume beef outputs per cattle are maintained while we are able to be more efficient and produce it faster. Secondly, measures for the grassland, which are the increased utilization of grass clover as a system. So we assume that currently most of the systems are using perennial ryegrass, so a very traditional system with high inputs of calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and replacing that with clover that can take the nitrogen to a large degree from the air is one of the measures, as well as replacing the conventional fertilizers with protected urea. In addition, we're looking at improved grass utilization within farms, so that's basically mostly for farm management and how intensive the farms are managed, especially for beef farms. That's an important part. In terms of deforestation, first of all, we're assuming that the spared grasslands, which you can see at the bottom there, 50% of them will remain as grasslands, just to combine different targets that we have. So on one side we have climate targets, on one side we have targets for biodiversity, especially with the nature restoration law now in Europe. So we're assuming that both of the spared land can be diversified into either direction. And then finally we have enteric fermentation reduction through methane inhibitors. So in total, we have 3 ambitions and 7 greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, which ended up in just over 2,000 scenario combinations that were modeled. And these are the results. So as you can see, the x-axis there with 0 indicating what would be classified as net zero. And about 20% of all of the scenarios actually ended up achieving net zero. What you can see here at the top right is the baseline in terms of both emissions, but also grassland area. So just over 4 million hectares is the baseline of grassland use, and for the net zeros, for the scenario that achieved net zero with the least amount of change in terms of land use, we still have at least 1.5 million hectares of land sparing. Half of that would be going into forestry, so we're talking about 750,000 hectares that would be required to achieve net zero and balance out all of the emissions from the agricultural sector. To put that into perspective, three of these scenarios. So first of all, the baseline at the top right, then the one that I just mentioned with that I called the minimal land use change here, and then finally the one where all of the 7 abatement measures were deployed to the highest degree. And we can see between the baseline and the tool scenarios that we have a big decrease in terms of agricultural emissions. So these are the brown, red-ish colored bars there. And we have a big increase in terms of the forest sinks that are deployed, that are making up the bulk of offset. So in terms of ranking these mitigation aspects, first of all, it is very important to note that the current herd configuration that we have in Ireland is not able to achieve net zero. And as I mentioned, large-scale afforestation is required with a bias towards coniferous species. So three of the measures, or one of the mitigation measure was looking at whether we deploy deciduous trees or we deploy coniferous trees. And we found that especially coniferous species, which is probably not a surprise to most of you, are far more effective in terms of storing carbon. Secondly, grass clover was a very important feature on the pathway towards net zero. So we could see that it first of all spares some land because it is quite effective in terms of producing grass anyway, and then finally it removes a lot of the inorganic nitrogen fertilizer, nitrous oxide emissions. And in terms of the least effective measures with the smallest impact, we saw that reducing mean slaughter ages and changing towards protected urea as a fertilizer type had the smallest impact. So coming back to what I alluded to in the beginning, which is actually how do we define net zero? In all the scenarios that we used up until now, we deployed a GWP 100 framework, which means that we're looking at a 100-year time frame and considering that, or assuming that carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane are all have equal properties, and it takes well about a 100-year time frame that we're looking at with different global warming potentials. However, that disregards the fact that methane has a strong short-term climate impact compared to nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, which are far more long-term. Which has big implications for countries with large livestock sectors, for example Ireland, for example New Zealand, and other countries. So what we did is post-hoc analysis with three different net zero definitions, but within the GWP 100 framework. So first of all, and this is what I presented, was all gases need to be offset by 2050. Secondly was that carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide remain as they are, so they can offset each other, but methane needs to be reduced separately by 32%. This is from recent literature saying that agricultural emissions globally need to be reduced by 32%, so we scaled the global level down to the national level. And then finally, CO2 needs to be offset by 2050, but then nitrous oxide and methane need to be offset by 2070 instead of 2050. And all of these definitions were applied with 3 levels of annual afforestation rates. So I mentioned earlier, 750,000 hectares is what is needed, divided by 25 years, 2025 to 2050, meaning that we would end up with afforestation rates of about 30,000 hectares, which is more than what has previously been achieved. So the first rate is 24,000 hectares, which was the maximum, and 8,000 then, which is the current policy target. And that has an impact on the net zero compliance. So the 418 scenarios is what you saw earlier, what I presented in the previous graph. And we can see that under this GWP 100 definition, with all gases being offset by 2050, there are no pathways towards net zero with less than 24,000 hectares. If we look at different definitions where methane only needs to be reduced by 32%, we can see that forestry becomes less important, which means that we still require around about 8,000, so about 10% then actually end up being close to net zero. But then once we have really high rates, there's no impact anymore in terms of the number of successful scenarios. And once a scenario basically fulfills this methane reduction target, it is kind of automatically net zero. And then finally, if we look at towards 2070 offsetting, we can see that this is a far more giving definition in terms of how many scenarios actually achieve net zero, and this is giving a big advantage to increasing the number of successful scenarios anyway. Talking about advantages in a little bit. So what are the conclusions? First of all, this work presents very intensive pathways towards net zero, because we had the aim of looking at if it is possible to maintain the current agricultural production. In reality, there are of course other options. So we are using the Goblin model to explore a number of these landscape choices, which basically a lot of these options are choices really for policymakers. What the current what targets are going to be prioritized. So first of all, extensification of livestock production, which would end up being producing less protein and less afforestation, but at the same time enhancing biodiversity. Secondly, diversification of protein outputs away from bovine system towards other ones, which might be a more resilient practice rather than focusing on dairy production. Thirdly, circular bioeconomy expansion for both materials and bioenergy, linked with carbon capture technologies, for example, BECCS, and looking at how the land sector would be able to absorb these. Fourthly, improving the spatial resolution and moving from national to catchment level. And this is where some of the soil groups that I mentioned earlier come into play. So how productive are these soils, and looking at them spatially, which measures can be deployed where, and where are conversions realistic. And then finally, looking at the economic dimensions. So of course, I haven't mentioned any of that. So this is purely from the environmental perspective. So that is definitely lacking at the moment. And then finally, national net zero definitions need to reflect the physical warming properties, but at the same time be robust to international scrutiny. So that's why some of the concerns are about scaling down the national, the global agricultural greenhouse gas reduction targets to a national level would imply that countries with a very, very high historic emissions have a little bit of an advantage there. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions. I am going to take the chair's prerogative to ask people to keep their questions to the point, so that we can hear the most from Daniel, and then we'll have a few questions, and then I'll move on to the next presentation and have some time hopefully for questions at the end on overall. So yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I was wondering, in your scenarios, do you know when did you reach the LULUCF targets for the European Commission? Because like every other European country, Ireland has a abatement target in the LULUCF sector, and right now there's a projection showing that that's not happening. So that difference right there, when did you reach that in the scenarios? And then I was also wondering if you had discussed internally in your group, instead of, in regards to the GDP numbers, to basically autocate, instead of doing a 100 number, then let's say you wanted 2050, then you did a GVP 25, which was basically the 25 years that we have left towards that. Is that have you discussed that, or how have you? Yeah, what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll start with the second part of the question about the GWP. GWP different metrics, I suppose. There was one paper by someone else from our group, George Bishop. He was looking at basically similar scenarios like that, but with a range of about 15 different GWP metrics. So this is really only kind of a flavor of what has been done. For example, GWP star, a big one in the discussions. Yeah, but in generally, like, I think we're quite hesitant in terms of changing the overall metrics, just because the current standard is to look at 2050 in terms of offsetting everything. That's the IPCC definition. So I'm always a bit on the careful side in terms of promoting anything else. But at the same time, I think there will be more international discussions needed, especially within the EU. I think to kind of come to an agreement there, because it is very, like what I described. A lot of the scenarios are extremely difficult to meet, especially in terms of deforestation. I think most people would say it's very unrealistic that we'll get anywhere close to these afforestation rates even. But so then it's very easy to just say, okay, why don't we just change the baseline? Why don't we go into the metric, because that's easy to change. So yeah, a bit hesitant about that. And now I've kind of forgotten the first. Sorry. Yeah. So we have assumed that just because within Ireland, I suppose there isn't quite a target for LULUCF anyway. That is like just a climate neutral sector by 2050. So this is what we've assumed, that all the emissions from the LULUCF sector need to be offset as well.
Yeah, follows on one of your last points. I think the current planting rate in Ireland is like under 2,000 hectares a year, and even your like cautious one is 8,000 and going up to like crazy numbers relative to the present. So where does that leave actually achieving this? And slightly related, will you be looking at silvopasture and kind of future scenarios?
Yeah, well, where does that leave us in terms of meeting it? It will be extremely difficult. I don't think there's two ways of saying that. We're advocating for higher forest rates. Obviously, I think about 80% of all the land is in Ireland is in private hands. So you won't get anywhere without the landowners buying in, the farmers buying in, and it's a big question because I suppose there are two strategies towards increasing the forest cover in the first place. Are we saying that kind of every farm needs to set a small area aside, or are we looking at like more at the large scale, and where is this large scale change possible? And that multi-land ownership makes it extremely difficult. So that's a question that no one quite has found the answer to. But at the same time, I suppose we're remaining optimistic, and it will be a question that needs to be solved sooner rather than later, because obviously it takes time to accumulate the carbon storage from the forests, and if we don't ramp up the things in the next few years, the time will run up until 2050. So that will be tough.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next presentation, and then we'll have a couple questions for that one, and then we'll have hopefully some time at the end for questions for both Rene and Daniel at the very end.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. Rene Reyes. I'm a researcher in Instituto Forestal in FOR in the south of Chile. And with my colleagues have been working on this in the context of the FABLE initiative. This initiative has been creating and evaluating different pathways for sustainable land use and food systems that could be consistent with global objectives like the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and can inform also national policy commitment. FABLE today is working in more than 20 countries with group of local researchers doing scenarios, building scenarios, future scenarios, and comparing that scenario with a business as usual one or the current trend scenario, in order to see the impact of this scenario in key and very important social and environmental indicators like carbon emissions, biodiversity, access to food, etc. So what is driving the work of FABLE is people's consumption of agricultural products. So what depends on different characteristics, of diets, and also the productivity of crops, of livestock in the different countries. So the different country teams are using different models, but also we have a common tool, which is a very complex and Excel-based tool, which allow us to project our numbers by 2050 in terms of all different dimensions that I mentioned. But in the current version of the FABLE calculator, the forestry sector, so all the timber production, is not really included. So only is including agricultural products and livestock. So forest in the current version of the FABLE calculator is just a land use class contributing to very important, key indicators like biodiversity when there is deforestation because of the expansion of agriculture or urban areas. So in order to see or evaluate really the impact of including forestry, so the forest sector and timber production on the outputs of the FABLE, we have been building a forestry model to better represent the interactions between the agricultural sector, forestry, and also biodiversity. So in the forestry model that we developed, one of the first aspects that we included is the differentiation between natural forest divided by the different biomes, so tropical forest, temperate forest, boreal forest, but also tree crops, eucalyptus plantations, pines, which are being very important in the timber supply, timber production, especially in some countries like Brazil, Argentina, China, etc. So that was the first aspect, because they also, these two forest resources are very different in ecological terms and in the way how landowners and forest companies are managed these different natural resources, forest resources. So some pictures of populus, pine plantations, eucalyptus, they are much more similar than an agricultural crop than a natural forest itself. So that was the reason. So the other aspect that we included in the forestry model is the natural regeneration, because forests can also naturally invade agricultural lands, abandon agricultural lands and other lands in a natural process. So we consider two scenarios for natural regeneration: a 1% of natural regeneration between 2020 and 2050, so in 30 years, which is very conservative really, and a second scenario, a more optimistic one, with 2% of natural regeneration for the same period. So this is a piece of land that they have in the south of Chile, which is an example of a natural regeneration. So also we include forest management, so silviculture, different harvesting intensities. The first one is very common, and everybody can see that sometimes in the mountains, the clear cut, where about 95% of the total biomass in a forest is removed. But also we included a less intense method, the selective logging, where about 30% of the total biomass can be removed. So two alternatives for silviculture. And also we included this other criteria, because outside protected areas, not all forests in a country are available for timber production, because you have physical constraints because of the roads, the accessibility to the forest, and you have also financial constraints, because the transportation cost from the forest to the facilities where the timber is processed could be very high, so that forests are not used for timber production. So it's also included there. Also, we are working with two key parameters. The first one is the mean annual increment, so the average forest growth, and also the average volume per hectare at the harvesting age, which is very important, because if you see that volume start to decrease along time, you can assume that your forest in average is losing biomass, is losing stock, so it could be in a forest degradation process, which is a very complex process. This is a very simplified version of forest degradation, because the concept is much more complex than that, but we are including that also in the model. So concerning the forest product, we considered one main primary product, which is roundwood, and 4 secondary products. So pulpwood, saw logs, other industrial roundwood, and wood fuels. So in the case of Canada, the Canadian wood fiber cascade, so we can see that the primary product is the total roundwood that Canada is harvesting from its forests, and 4 secondary products, depending on the different uses of the timber. So this comparison, the result that I will show you in the next slides, was performed for 2 fabulous scenarios, which were developed by the last Scenathon, which is a marathon of scenarios that we are running every year with all the different country teams to see how these scenarios work at a global level. Okay, the first comparison was for the current trend scenario, comparing the output from the Fable calculator without the forest, including the forestry model, and with including the forestry model. And the second comparison was for the sustainable scenario, and the same, with and without including the forestry model. So these are the aspects that we are including in these scenarios, the current and the sustainable scenario, different aspects, but concerning forestry, in the current trend scenario, we consider free expansion of the agriculture, and in the sustainable one, we are including that no more deforestation after 2030. Concerning afforestation, in the current trend scenario, we consider in Canada no afforestation in between 2020 and 2050, and in the sustainable one, we are including 2 million hectares of additional plantations in Canada. And concerning natural regeneration, the 1% natural regeneration for the current trends and the 2% for the sustainable scenario. So this is the main probably part of the presentation, because we can see the impact of including the forestry model into the Fable calculator and in the outputs of the Fable calculator. So without including the forestry model, in the case of the current trend and for Canada, we have 313 million tons of CO2 equivalent accumulated between 2020 and 2050 for LULUF. And with including the forestry model, we have a little bit more emissions, right? 324. The reason of that is, of course, the harvesting of timber. All the clear cut, all the forestry activity where you are harvesting an area forest. Despite we include the 1% natural regeneration. But what is interesting is when we see the sustainable scenario, in the case of without including forestry, emissions are 52 million tons of CO2 equivalent for the same period, and with the forestry model, we see a reduction to 20 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That is because two reasons. The first one is the 2% natural regeneration, so the model is very sensible to the natural process, forest recovering process, and also the 2 million hectares of new plantations between 2020 and 2050, which is not so much for Canada. Canada is 900 million hectares, so forest is 400 million hectares, so it's not really a significant area for Canada. It's small. So, but considering that, you can see that the output from the Fable calculator changed a lot, including the forestry model. Also, what we saw is by including the forestry model, adult forest and land where natural processes predominate tend to decrease because of a higher productive pressure. It's normal, especially when companies or landowners perform selective logging, they cut the bigger trees, the older trees. It starts with the older forest. So that is a problem and could be a critical aspect of this, because adult forests have a very significant importance for biodiversity. So it's something that we should take into account. Okay, for the future, because what we include now is very limited, in the future we should improve the carbon accounting of the forestry model, because forests are accumulating carbon not only in the main trunk of the trees, or of course they are accumulating carbon in the soil, below ground biomass, all the roots and all of that, the branches. So we have to improve that in the next version. And also we should include the forest development stages. So this is the growth of a forest. So it's not the same having adult forest than having young forest or forest regenerating from a biodiversity or environmental perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. It's totally different. Some adult forests can be very important for some First Nations and for local communities, for a cultural perspective. So we also should include something we are looking this very common, unfortunately now, this is wildfires and other catastrophic events. We have to include that in the forestry model, because big areas of forest have been affected by wildfires. In Canada 2 years ago, the total area was affected by this was 14 million hectares was affected by wildfires. And this year in Brazil and other tropical countries, we are looking the same, very big wildfires. Also, there is a big potential, positive potential of timber replacing high-intensity materials like aluminium, concrete, and other building materials, and also in the biomaterials, sector, and in bioenergy. And finally, we are now in the process of doing the same exercise, but with more favored country teams, because this was only for Canada. So now we are working with the Russian team, the Chinese team, Brazil, and others in order to run the calculator with the forestry model to see more global result of doing that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rene. We have plenty of time for questions. First, we'll start with a couple questions specifically for Rene, if anybody has one. Yeah.
How do you want to include the wildfires in your scenarios? Do you have an idea on which years it would happen and which specific places it would happen, maybe?
In Canada at least there are good statistics about wildfires, but the distribution is very crazy, so depending on the year. But you can consider some average, but also you can consider some scenarios about wildfires. So scenarios where wildfires will increase, and others where probably, I don't know, countries will be able to control the wildfires because they are investing on that. So it's an aspect that we can include in our scenarios.
I'll say in some other modeling work that is being presented right now by my PhD student in a different session, right? One of the things we do with our modeling in a different model is to assume that you get some forest carbon, or you model out the forest carbon, but then you have sort of a point in time where you realize that forest carbon is kind of gone because of wildfires and everything else, and you have to adjust the model partway through the model run to determine the effect it has. So there may be something we can do similar to that. I'm not sure. We have to talk about it more.
But I think it's something that we should include definitely, because it's a huge emissions because of that.
Yes, thank you very much, Rene, for this wonderful presentation. I have a question on how deterministic is the model itself. So how much the model can tell you about some unexpected results, for example, when you introduce some small changes in... Yes.
Deterministic. It's a very deterministic exercise, but exists the possibility to run the same idea basically, because what is important here more than the numbers, is the idea that having a broader perspective of the agricultural sector, including forestry, have an impact on the outputs. So that is the idea, So we can use better models. The Fable calculator is very deterministic. It's a tool designed to facilitate the work of different country teams in very different contexts, in developing countries, different contexts. So that's why we are using that. But of course, we can improve that. But the idea is that, forestry as a productive sector, part of the agricultural sector, can do a positive but also a negative contribution to our projections. So there are the interactions basically, It's not only the agriculture advancing in the forest. Forest also can advance and take agricultural lands and with its impact on biodiversity. So the interaction is important.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. Just one question on the wood use, which as far as I know is projected to increase quite a lot globally. Is that something that you think would be able to introduce to the model, or is it maybe already in there to some degree?
But sorry, I didn't understand.
Yeah.
Wood use. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Good assumption. Yeah. Sure. In the current version of the forestry model, we have a forest management component, but also a component for the final use of the timber. So we can create a scenario concerning that. For instance, a higher proportion of the timber going to biomaterials or bioenergy or the construction sector. So that is relevant because allow you to project numbers in different situations and mix that with all the agricultural outputs and all of that.
model already assumes some increase in wood consumption going forward out to 2050 from the present, because we have growth in population, growth in economy, so it increases demand. And
but
so
but also depends on the international market, because
right.
for instance, the Canada forest sector now is in a big crisis because of the competition on the barriers with the US, the problem with China. They have China had some issues. So I'm not Canadian, so I can talk about that. So depends on different aspects. But at least you have the potential to do that, you know, and you can see how different policies could affect these different outputs.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is, how do you introduce uncertainty? Say, for example, when you're talking about 1%, 2%, I mean, rather than working with point measurement, you know, like ranges.
We can do that. We can do that in the Fable calculator. You know, include some. She's the expert of the Fable calculator. I'm not the main expert, but we can include some ranges to see the impact of that decisions. But also, of course, all the numbers that we put in the calculator have to be based on research. So all the percentage concerning natural regeneration is based on papers, on knowledge. So, but we can do some ranges to see the sensibility of the model depending the change of some components. Yeah. But this is very deterministic and it's very simple. But you can play. You can play.
My Fable partners are going to yell at me or take me out back and do something to me if I mention this. One thing that has been in my mind that we have not done is there are add-on tools that one could use with. I think we could do this that would actually allow us to run Monte Carlo simulations on the parameters. And so that would be one way to introduce the uncertainty into it. So we could parameterize that. But I here and here they're gonna yell. You can hear someone yelling for a moment.
I think the Australian team did an example of that. Yeah, but at very beginning. Yeah, look.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of things we can play around with it at some point in time. Okay, let me open it up to see if there's any questions more generally for both of our panelists, in case there's something that's a broader thing that anybody wants to ask. Yeah.
So it's a very naive question, but is the forestry sector covered by other land use model? And have you compared it, how does it perform compared to what you do with the Fable forestry model?
3 models?
Yeah, other models, other land use models that include the forestry sector. Are you aware of them, and how do they perform compared to the model, the Fable forestry module?
Yeah, we could do that, I think, but.
Which is things like Google Biome or GCAM and how they.
But there is I don't know. You can complement my answer, but we were looking the Google Biome, and the problem is some models are always assuming that agriculture is going to advance in forest, but that depends on the location of the forestry facilities. For instance, in my country, if you put a pulp facility in a place, all the agricultural land around will be planted with eucalyptus. So some models are doing that assumptions, and I feel it's very difficult. I don't know if there is a model which is really integrating the agricultural sector, forestry sector, and biodiversity in a right way. I have the feeling that we don't have that. Because in Canada there is very good forestry models, but they are forestry models. Just the forest, that's timber. No agriculture. So this is challenging. So I think it's something that we should think more about.
Are there any questions for both of our panelists that people want to ask? All right. I was going to take chair's prerogative, but I'll pass it back.
I wanted to ask about the growth rates and the growth rates of the because it's. I saw estimates that was in the Europe as a whole, and I think the EEA, the EU Environmental Agency, they estimated I think 150 million additional million tons of CO2 being captured because of the rising temperatures and the cutoff rates of that. Is that something that you're working with, or thinking about integrating in this module as a parameter that you can play with?
Yeah, all the parameters could be fixed or could be variable, so you can play with that. So you can assume a scenario for growing rates. And what you are talking is very true, because unfortunately, because of climate change, in some areas forests are growing less than in the past. So it's something that is changing a lot. And even some forests are having negative growing rates. That doesn't mean that the trees are going smaller. That means the trees are dying because of the lack of water, the drought and all of that. So it's something that we could create a scenario considering that. Yeah. I don't know if I am answering your question. Yeah? Thank you.
Paula.
So I guess I have a question to both speakers about trade in relation to their sustainable pathways, and particularly between assumptions around afforestation versus managing kind of both, because I guess I'm afraid I missed most of your presentation, but I heard the conversation after about your ambitious afforestation rates. The EU has massive tree planting targets, so does the UK, so do many countries now, and then there are countries that already have a very big forestry industry, and I guess your further work one was to try and maybe you do a full skenathon to understand what that means for global trade in timber products. And again, I don't know, Daniel, whether your work has worked out actually if you do meet those afforestation rates, how will those big woodlands and forests be managed? Will you then suddenly be self-sufficient in timber? Will you be promoting more timber use in construction and other industries in Ireland? And then again, do you know studies that have already looked at sort of timber trade in these sustainable pathways? And actually, if all of these countries do suddenly do lots and lots of afforestation or reforestation, what does it mean to the countries that are already trying to have a export trade in timber?
Go try again.
Hello? Oh, okay. Yeah, coming on the first point, I suppose. So right now Ireland is very far from exporting anything in terms of wood products. But I think just in terms of the net zero scenarios, I think until 2050 we kind of minimize the amount of harvest that is taking place, just so we can generate the big carbon sinks in the first place, and then gradually until 2080, because we also have some other work that is concerned of how do we maintain that net zero if we actually get there, until the end of the century, so 2100. And usually the scenarios turn out to be that we need to increase the sinks until about 2080. And then from there, we kind of have a healthy forest sector that on one side provides a lot of wood products that can then be used for substitution as well, hopefully, replacing some of the steel components of construction, for example. But on the other side, deliver long-term carbon storage that will be desperately needed, I suppose. Yeah, maybe you want to.
I didn't understand all your question, but this is about the impact of deforestation.
So if we are imagining that all these various countries are, so if Ireland, for example, does all this afforestation and starts to produce timber, as other countries are going to do, start to produce timber, then countries like Canada, which are dependent on the timber trade now, as the incumbents in some senses of the timber trade, what's going to happen to that? And to what degree are we thinking about including timber trade within sort of a mini scenathon with the other countries that we're doing the forest module with as well? So another way of sort of two.
But I think the most no, it's not because I am a forester, but the most interesting thing with the timber that is very flexible, very plastic material. So you can replace a lot of things by using timber. So in Chile, for instance, now there is a new policy to replace bricks and concrete by timber for doing like buildings or something like that. In Canada, that is very developed. So you can use the timber. The timber is not just for export. You can use the timber in your own country, your own communities. In circular economy, all of that. It's very like timber is very. It's a very good idea for that kind of futures. You know? Accumulating carbon in our cities, in our materials, in the energy matrix too. So yeah.
I think it does speak to the power of our consortium, the Fable Consortium. So I'm plugging the Fable Consortium for those of you who are not part of Fable, which is that we have all these various countries doing using same tool to model national level activities aggregated up to the global level through the trade adjustments. Because I think we do see situations in which various countries, when they're modeling independent of anybody else, everybody's making I'm sure somebody did the exercise of taking all these various models that all these various countries are putting together and aggregating it all up. It wouldn't match, right? Like country X is thinking, oh well, we can produce this and export that, and somebody else is thinking, hey, look at that, we can produce this and export that too, right? And they're not talking to one another, and so you don't have the ability to sort of figure out what's actually going to happen at the global level. So the power of the consortium is to be able to do that. So as we develop and push out the forestry module to the various consortium members and do this initial exercise with about 4 or 5 countries, right? We can kind of start to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I agree very much what you're saying, and I just wanted to point out that there's a recent study showing looking into all the NDCs of all countries in the world and trying to match up land conversions in the individual NDCs, and I believe it was almost half of the world's area which was suddenly being claimed to land conversion, which is totally unrealistic, right? So.
Right. I think those exercises like that are quite interesting, right? And so if you have Ireland imagining they're going to start putting all these forests together, right? And as other countries saying we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then how realistic is it? I guess I'll ask one. We're running out of time. I'll ask one question to mainly I'm going to ask it to Daniel because I'm not familiar with what's going on in Ireland, and maybe it's an unfair question because you presented a bunch of modeling, but I want to bring it to the policy side of things and to ask within the Irish context. You've got this model where you're interacting. You're basically looking at livestock and then its effect on the potential forest sector, right? So it's sort of a spillover effect type of thing. But within the policy world within Ireland, where do these two different sectors sit in the policy environment in Ireland, and so how easy is it to sort of think about integrated policy to try to achieve some of what you've put out in the model itself?
Well, first of all, it's not very easy. I think that's a very simple answer, because right now it is quite difficult to even come up with any kind of conversion into forestry. And I think I've heard it in some presentations yesterday. When you convert your agricultural land into forest land, it's often a perceived loss of value, just because you lose a lot of flexibility. And I think that's something that needs to be overcome to a certain degree, and it's probably not going to happen without any kind of subsidies or other support schemes that will make that transition easier and facilitate it a little bit. So yeah, I think it's quite difficult, and we'll see if there's any solutions. I'm not sure I'm sure this problem exists in many countries. So I welcome anyone who might be able to share something from their country.
Right. Certainly in Canada, where our forestry sector and our agricultural sector are separated, right, from a ministerial perspective, and so that becomes an issue. And so we held a workshop 2 years ago where we actually brought agriculture people and forestry people together in the same room to talk to each other.
Well, in Ireland, the department is actually the same, and it's called the Department of Agriculture. So I think that gives you a little bit of perspective in terms of, the valuation.
All right, we are at time, and I don't want to keep people from, I think there's another coffee break if I'm not mistaken, so I don't want to keep people from their coffee and their snacks. Please join me in thanking Daniel and Rene for their presentations and their answers to the questions. I thank you all for an interesting discussion, and wish you a good rest of your day.